Think we're on live now. Let's see. Let me go to. Yes, we are live now.
Sunshine. I've got the sunshine
We're
in my face.
live
That's
now.
why I'm wearing this hat.
Okay. So we're live and we'll start. Okay.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. I'm Sherab Turchin here, Executive Director of Canada Tibet Committee. And we're here back today with another topic of discussion on Tibet-related issues. As many of you may know, Tibet issue is a multifaceted, multi-layered issue, and one of the most pressing, most urgent issue that needs immediate attention is the forced relocation of Tibetan nomads and the creation of national parks that are used as pretext to force Tibetan nomads to relocate. And so we're here joined by two very important guests today to discuss the issue. We have Kyinzom Dhongdue from Australia. We have Michael Buckley from Thailand. Kyinzom is the Executive and Campaign Officer of Australia-Tibet Council. She's also the member of Tibetan Parliament in exile. And Michael Buckley is the Canadian author and filmmaker with a long-term research focus on Southeast Asian and Himalayan regions. He's the author of the book Meltdown in Tibet. So our first speaker for the day is Ms. Kyinzom Dhongdue, who will speak on the forced relocation of Tibetan nomads for about 10 minutes. And then we'll have Michael speaking on the Tibet's paper park. Yes, please, Kyinzom La, take over from here. Thank you. First of all, thank you for joining, Kyinzom La. Yes.
Thank you, Sherbla, for inviting me. And it's so lovely to speak and with Michael and yourself to the Canada Tibet Committee supporters. So first of all, I want to acknowledge that I am standing on the Daruk and Gurungai people's land. In Australia, we have a tradition of acknowledging the country, and I want to pay my respect to the elders past and present, and acknowledge that the sovereignty of the Indigenous people of Australia has never been ceded. Now, today we are talking about the forced displacement of nomads, something that we also see here in Australia as a result of the European colonization. And first, I will share my presentation. It's not a very long presentation, and I will keep it brief and simple. So let me share the screen first. Can you see that?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. All right, so I will call this an iron fist in a green glove, and I think that's what we are going to talk about. As Sherabla outlined in the beginning, that under the disguise of conservation and environmental protection, the Chinese government has been, forcibly displacing the nomads from their ancestral land. And that's what we are going to talk about today. Now, if you look at the world of Tibetan nomads, you will see a very, acute interdependence between the land of Tibet and the people of Tibet, in particular, the traditional stewards, the traditional custodians of the Tibetan grasslands, the nomads. And there is a very popular saying among the nomadic community in Tibet that people, this is the rough English translation, that people depend on livestock and the livestock depend on grasslands. So what we can see that, when we glimpse into this world of Tibetan nomads, we see a very sophisticated way of life that is, carefully tuned to the local environment, grounded in a deep connection to their land and their environment, and guided by rich local knowledge. And in fact, it is this unique kind of partnership between the nomads and their animals and their land that has made life on the Tibetan plateau, on the cold, arid, roof of the land possible in the first place. Tibetan nomads have lived and flourished on the grasslands for thousands of generations, for thousands of years, and the nomads, like those people living very close to the land, understand that their lives depend on the health of pastures, on the water sources, and the complex kind of web of life that surrounds them. So they take care of their land, they take care of their environment, and especially to the Tibetan nomads, the landscape is sacred. They are inhabited by many spirits and deities, and are fiercely protected. Now, today, as the world, including China, grapples with the intertwined challenges of climate change, food security, water security, biodiversity loss, it is important that they look and learn from the Tibetan nomads and how they have applied their traditional knowledge in taking care of the environment. But unfortunately, this is not how China is seeing it. And Tibet, if you look at the situation in Tibet, and in particular to the nomads, you see two things that are happening. First, there's the climate change, and then there's the ongoing, impacts of colonization. So it is as if, the Tibetans are facing one injustice on top of another. Tibetans are dealing with these twin challenges of a very old problem of Chinese colonization. Likewise, they are now facing this, relatively new global challenge, climate change. And we have to see that, how these two are interrelated when it plays out in China. And now, Tibetan nomads, for the last 20 years, as part of the Chinese policy to, return, and they call it, retire the pasture and restore the grassland. It's a kind of broad environmental policy that they have displaced. They have continued to displace the Tibetan nomads from their ancestral land, from the grassland. And so, I will just look at two kind of broad justifications that the Chinese have put forward, to do that. And these are, firstly, it's the development, or poverty alleviation, and secondly, is the conservation and environmental protection. Now, looking at both these kind of arguments, you can see that these are, the same justifications that colonial empires use, to displace people, to dispossess people, and that's what has been happening inside Tibet. And so the Chinese kind of mindset is that the Tibetan people are backward, the Tibetan people are primitive, Tibetan people are ignorant. And now this is a striking kind of example of modern day colonialism and racism. It overlooks the fact that the Tibetan nomads have survived and flourished sustainably for a very, very long time before the Chinese came to Tibet. And the damages that we are seeing today in Tibet actually is largely a result of the rapid changes that have been brought under the Chinese rule. The Chinese policies have been totally misguided, with no kind of respect for local knowledge, no regard for local traditions. So this is what we are seeing at the heart of these policies, is this kind of colonial mindset. And so for the Tibetan people, for the Chinese people, backwardness is not good. Backward leads to social instability, and social instability is not good. It leads to political instability. So the Chinese think that it is important to lift Tibetan people out of poverty. But the irony is that the Tibetan nomads actually feel that they are worse off, when they are removed from their ancestral land, when they are removed from their traditional source of sustenance. And in fact, Tibetan nomads who once live, self-sufficient lives have suddenly been thrust into this, poverty. And so we can see that, this is a carefully, managed state-engineered destruction of a culture, of an ancient culture and way of life. Today, the nomads being thrust into the urban fringes of the, of the Chinese economy. Tibetan nomads have to really start from the bottom of the social and economic ladder. And this is causing, enormous social problems in the nomadic communities. China likes to use all these words, ecological migrants, that these are voluntary. And the reality is that, Tibetan people, given a choice, they would like to continue their, traditional way of life. That said, we should not also assume that, all the young Tibetan men and women in Tibet, would like to continue their nomadic way of life. Ultimately, what we are saying is that Tibetan people should have their own right to determine their own future, that it should not be, a top-down policy of, coercive policy of displacing the people from the land that they have lived on for generations. And it has to be, up to the Tibetan people, up to the Tibetan nomads to decide for themselves what's good for them. And it's true that many young Tibetans today and older Tibetans want to have, access to healthcare, want to have access to education for their children. So to label them as ecological migrants, it's a very misguided term. It is not, part of ecological civilization, these words that Xi Jinping likes to use, that Tibetans are choosing to, or if there are people choosing to leave the ancestral land, it's not because of that. It is because they want better access to healthcare, they want better access to education. So that's the first point that Chinese is using to lift the Tibetan nomads out of poverty. And the second thing is, again, the conservation, under the disguise of conservation and climate change, and that's what we have seen in Tibet. The Chinese
Recording has started.
Has it stopped? Has the live stopped? Hello, can you hear me?
Hello, Sharp, can I hear you?
Hi, can you hear me?
No, it's on live, Kyinzom Dhongdue. Sorry.
Okay. Sorry.
It's on live, yes.
All right. So yes, talking about the second justification about conservation and environmental degradation, Tibetan nomads are blamed, are made the scapegoats of China's environmental problems, that the grassland is degrading. Yes, it is true that, the grassland is degrading, but, it is not true that the nomads are responsible. In fact, it is the result of, many decades of misguided policies from Beijing that has led to the degradation of the Tibetan grasslands. And likewise, if China wants to, address the climate crisis, they have to protect the grasslands. That's very true. The grasslands cover more than half, 50% of the Tibetan plateau, and the grasslands being such an important storage of carbon it's critical to addressing the climate crisis. And, grasslands need people, and it's the Tibetan people who have looked after the grasslands. Now, by removing the Tibetan nomads from the grasslands, depopulating the grassland is not good, ultimately not good for the health of the grasslands. And, this is exactly what numerous scientists over the years have said, including many from China. And likewise, China talks about conservation, biodiversity loss. Yes, that's true. We are facing this crisis in Tibet, in China, and around the world. But again, to talk about removing the nomads from the grasslands, that's again a very misguided policy. And I won't talk about this here too much because our next speaker, Michael, will talk about the national parks that are coming up in Tibet this year. And in fact, the forced displacement of nomads is set to accelerate under this program, and arguably we will see the end of the nomadic way of life with the unveiling of these national parks across the Tibetan plateau. And that is really sad, because what it means is that the Tibetan people are losing water security, food security, our mode of traditional food production. So I'm just being aware of the time. I might, conclude here and, hand over to Michael, and then have more, time for Q&A. So ultimately, what I'm saying is that, ultimately it is the Tibetan people who has to decide. It is an issue of self-determination. And, if the Chinese people are really genuine addressing the climate crisis in Tibet, Tibetan people, especially the nomads, have to be part of the climate solutions. So I'll just end here and open, hand over to Michael.
Thank you, Kyinzom Dhongdue. Thank you so much for sharing your insights on the topic. Yes, Michael, please take over from here.
Should I come up full screen on the? You've got to get rid of the sharing, the photo sharing.
Sure.
Otherwise, you won't see me on the screen.
Okay, sorry.
So you got me on the screen now? Did I click?
Yes, very much. Yeah.
You see me on the screen, okay? Because I'm seeing small on the screen. Whatever. Okay. I would like to talk about a ecological mystery before we begin, because this is a book by Daniel Taylor. It's called Yeti: Ecology of a Mystery, and he goes off for 10 years looking for the abominable snowman, the Yeti, which he ends up realizing is just a Tibetan brown bear, which I could have told him before he started that that's what he was going to find, because the footprint is always a Tibetan brown bear, which is the same as a basketball player. It's very tall, it's 6 feet tall, and previous expedition, Reinhold Messler, Edmund Hillary, they've always concluded it's come out as a Tibetan brown bear. There's no mystery here. The mystery in this book is that he was involved with setting up national parks, particularly the one at Everest, Chomolungma. And here's a quote from him. He says that he's only talking about the TAR. He's not talking about Amdo Kam. He says 13 other protected areas, 44%. That's 80. There's none of these preserves, but that was before the program for 2020 national parks came along. By his figures, PAR would be covering 60% at least. Almost 2/3 of the area would be set aside for national parks. That's ridiculous. There's no country on the planet that can do that, that has done. We're talking about an enormous area. So I want to go back here, and then we're looking at Qinghai, which he has left out. Qinghai is now 50% national parks. With the additional, they greatly expanded the national park as part of this new 2020 program. So I want to go back with some statistics here. Chinese statistics, 1990s, TAR only, 4%. 4% was national parks and reserves. They didn't call them national parks, they just called them preserves. 2012, 35%. It went from 4% up to 35% in a matter of 20 years. Then it went to 54% under Taylor. That's the book I showed you. And if we add in the 2020 parks, it's gone to 60% at least, maybe more. Now this is really, really strange. The figures don't add up at all, right? You've got to think about this. Why do these figures, where do these big ballooning national parks come from? Well, if you correlate it with the settlement of the nomads, the years that the expansion has happened is exactly the same years that the nomads have been settled, which is 1990 to 2020. That's the exact years that they've ballooned, so it is more than a coincidence. And then I want to point out that I'm going to go into some pictures here. We're going to do some visuals. And but I just want to think about those figures. The mathematics does not add up at all, really. It's just really bizarre. Okay, I'm just going to go in here and grab some photos. I have it queued up. Okay, we're going to start with the, this is nicely provided by Kyinzom, actually. Simon, thank you, Simon. This is a part of the national park system for 2020, only part of it, only the bigger ones. Like you're not showing Everest here. Everest Chomolungma is not shown because it's smaller. Some of these are greatly expanded. These are very, very expanded national parks. I think we can bring that up to a bigger screen. Let's see if I can bring that up there. Okay, we can do it there. Okay, oh, that made it a little too big, but never mind. Some of these are greatly expanded. Sanjiang Yuan, which is over here, is greatly expanded. It was 20% of Qinghai before, now it's 50%. Hoshil is a World Heritage Site, inscribed 2017. Changtang is the second biggest park in the world after Greenland. That's been there for some time. It's 334,000 square kilometers. And then we have some new ones. Mount Chilian, which is up here, that's fairly new. I'll talk about that. And then down here we have a thing called Kailash Sacred Landscape, which is actually, it's a transboundary park. It goes into India. As long as they're not firing missiles at each other, it could be transboundary, right? Then we have the Great Panda National Park, which it was an existing park, but then it expanded. It greatly increased in size. So that's to give you an overview. Some of these are not new, they're expanded, or greatly expanded. Like 20% to 50% is a big expansion. Some of these have not been actually commissioned yet, or they're not done yet, like especially Kailash, because that's transboundary. The Giant Panda is well underway, and Chilianshan. So I want to go in here to give you an idea of what China is up to. This is a Chinese propaganda poster which shows that all is well on the grasslands. So what is that surveyor doing there? Well, he's surveying possibly for mining, possibly for dams. We don't know what he's surveying for, but it ain't a national park. That's fairly clear. And I want to just bring up something here that got me started long ago, back in the 90s. This is a sign for Chomolungma National Park. Our natural resources are limited, must be protected, respected. That's great. I was with a guide going into the back of Everest, the Tibetan side, and I said, "Isn't that fantastic? They're protecting the environment." And he turned around to me with a look of disgust on his face and said, "Oh no, that's just an excuse to get rid of the nomads." And that just hit me like a brick. Like, what? This is the first time I heard it. This is back in the 90s. And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And he said, "Well, my grandfather came from this area. I know what's going on here. This is what they're doing. They're just using that as an excuse." So Everest is a wonderful area, but you can't compare it to the side on the Nepalese side, Sagarmatha. It's a World Heritage Site on the Nepalese side. They have proper ranges. You don't have ranges at Everest on the Tibetan side. What you got is people throwing bottles out of the cars as they're coming in, and nobody's stopping them. This is this Chinese tourists. That's what they do. We're going to move along here to Chilianshan, which you saw is up in the northeast. It's a fairly big new park that's coming up. Before this national park came up, there was a couple of complaints in the area, and they investigated. And the complaints on official Chinese sources mentioned 52 illegal mining operations, 52 illegal mining operations in Chilianshan before they gazetted it for the national park. This is one of them. This is the Qingho group. There's 3.5 billion tons of coal in this area near the Chilianshan. If you look at this picture very carefully, it's very interesting. You get the snow caps up the top. You get the massive mining going on with the heavy loading trucks and stuff. And if you look down the bottom, there's a fox in the grasslands. And I look very confused, like, what's going on here? Why am I covered in black? So this was exposed by Greenpeace East Asia, which is it's an NGO based in Beijing. They do very good work. And it was exposed around 2014, which is 6 years ago, right? And nothing was done. It's still there. These operations are still ongoing. This is either at the edge of the park or it's inside the park. It's not clear. But they have 3 or 4 locations where they mine. And it's only recently that one of the bosses has been arrested. and he's been accused of having fake permits. They make themselves fake licenses. So I'm going to go here to the next picture. What this man told people was that he was actually cleaning up the grasslands. That's what it is. But at nighttime, what he would do, this is a photograph from actually from the Chinese website. I didn't make this up. They would go and mine the coal at night. But in the daytime, they would pretend to clean up the grasslands to get it ready for the national park. This is the kind of subterfuge that goes on, and of course, this must have been approved at the highest levels. So we're coming up here to some destruction. This photograph is actually taken in Kashgar. Thank you, Colin. And it shows, as you can see, rather large numbers of snow leopards turned into carpets. You know, snow leopards are actually also culled for traditional Chinese medicine, which I call traditional Chinese murder, which is extinction of species. They hunt them for the same reason they hunt tigers. Well, there's no tigers left in China. They farm them, but you know, they have all this baloney about, you know, consuming bones and so on. And the rest of the leopard is used as a carpet for very wealthy patrons. Unfortunately, I would go into a little bit of background here. You know, but first, before we do that, we need to get a bit of back information. Come up with this one. This is Ho Shil. Ho Shil is above Changtung. It was inscribed as a World Heritage Site against protest by lots of Tibetan groups, or Tibet support groups. The Tibetans themselves can't really protest. You'll notice the buffer zone. This is a Chinese ploy not to include the whole area. They talk about buffer zones. Nobody knows what buffer zones are. If you have a UN World Heritage Site, it's either a UN Heritage Site or it's not. You can't have buffer zones. Anyway, this area was famous for Tibetan antelopes. And there's a famous, I'll show you the next picture. There's a famous, oh, we have to go to the next slot, sorry. I want to go down here. We switched to another sharing. Sorry. There's a famous film that came out, which was made by a journalist from Beijing who was half Tibetan and half Chinese. Bring that up. Sorry, we have to go over here. Here's the film. It's called Kekashili Mountain Patrol. And if you get a chance to see this, I don't know if you can get it on Netflix or whatever. It's actually really remarkable that it was ever released, that it was allowed, because what you're looking at here is a Tibetan patrol. They call them the Yak Brigade, that was setting out to stop Chinese poachers from shooting down, machine gunning Tibetan antelopes, which they would sell for a great amount of money because the underwool is the finest wool in the world. And, you know, now the Tibetan antelope is protected, the state protection, the top level, but not at this time, which is, you know, anyway, what happened at the end of the movie, these Tibetans were so effective at shutting down the poachers that they got killed. They got shot by the poachers. The poachers got really annoyed because they were too good at it. And that's the reason you'll never find Tibetan, you know, Tibetan guards or patrollers, because they're too good at it. So here's the Chiru. That is up on the Changtang, you know, and it's rare to see this many Chiru in one group. This is a male group, because they've been wiped out, basically because of the chartreuse trade, but long before that, they were also wiped out by Chinese. And, you know, I've never seen a group this big. This is taken by another photographer. But, you know, they used to cover, when the British were there, they used to talk about antelopes as far as the eye could see. 10,000, 20,000, 30,000, 40,000, and not just antelopes. There would be wild yaks in herds. There would be Kyang. There would be gazelles. And you know, Tibetans left them alone, but it was like Serengeti. It was a massive wildlife area. And this was all disappeared from 1959 to 79. It all disappeared. It vanished. So where did it go? This is one of the greatest wildlife crimes of the 20th century. It vanished. Millions of animals just disappeared, even the birds. When the Dalai Lama's delegation went through 1979, 1980, they were stunned by what they saw, but they were also stunned by what they didn't see. And they didn't see any animals. There was no sounds. There was no sounds in the grasslands. So, you know, when we're talking about China conserving wildlife, and which is the reason for putting the national parks in, then you've got to be really suspicious of, you know, what's going on here. These people killed off millions of animals, and here they are trying to conserve them again. Now, I'm going to throw in an extra picture here. This is the Potala Palace, and you're wondering why I'm putting this in here. And the reason is it's a World Heritage Site, along with Nobalinka and Jokan, the 3 parts. This is a travesty. You shouldn't have a World Heritage Site. This is talking about the cultural things, not the landscape, where they don't honor the tradition and the history of this palace. It's about the Dalai Lamas, right? That's what it's built for. There is not a single picture of the Dalai Lama, not a single statue, nothing in that building that says 14th Dalai Lama. Absolutely nothing. If you go to Nobalinka, there's a painting on the wall, which will not let you photograph. If you go to the Tibetan Museum, there is a picture of Dalai Lama shaking hands with Mao Zedong, but he's not identified as the 14th. He's identified as the reincarnation of the 13th. I mean, how stupid can you get? So when we talk about World Heritage Sites, I think, China is pulling the wool over the UN Heritage Committee's eyes. I mean, you can't have a cultural site like this and not, actually have the history. So we're going to look at these World Heritage Sites here. This is the 3 parallel rivers World Heritage Site. Let's see, it's divided into different zones. You've got the scenic area, the protected area. What it does not specify is that the rivers themselves are not included in the site. And I want to draw your attention to the dams on this map. The red ones are finished. The blue ones are underway. There's 3 rivers. As soon as they got the World Heritage status, 2003, they immediately started building mega dams. This is an ecosystem that depends on the rivers. You can't take the rivers out. They're part of the system. Fortunately, they shut them down on the Salween, maybe for a while. But this is how, 10 years later, the World Heritage Site people went back to check it out. And they said, oh, yeah, there's a few dams here and there. Baloney. They can put this on a World Heritage and Danger list. They can remove it from the list. They've done it. They've removed things from the list. They removed the site in Germany because they put a 4-lane highway through the site, and they had a bridge. And they said, well, no, you can't do that in the World Heritage Site. We were delisting you. So why haven't they delisted? Why haven't they delisted this? This is an absolute travesty. They should delist it. So I'm going to move along here. I hope these are in order. Yes, they are. Well, that's remarkable. Okay, we're going to move along to our last World Heritage Site here. This is actually proposed in 2020. I don't think it was accepted. The one in Hoshil was. This is Kailash, you see on the left there. This is a caravan of yaks that takes the goods around for the people who are camping. They got tents and everything, you can see. And that's the way you get around Kailash. It's all done on foot. It's done with mules. It's done with yaks. Beautiful area, untouched, pristine. China wants to turn it into the Kailash sacred landscape. Well, one thing is Tibetans do not need a national park here. It's been a national park in their eyes for centuries. And along with the Buddhists, you don't need to turn it into a national park. What China is going to do is they're going to build a road all the way around Kailash, and they're already halfway. And then they'll probably build a gondolier all the way up to the top of that sacred peak. I mean, they've done it in parts of Yunnan already, in Sichuan. There's no doubt in my mind that that's what they're planning to do. And that will make it easier for the Chinese who can't adjust to the altitude to see the wonders of Tibet. Now, I've only got a few pictures left here. This is Manasarovar, which is attached to Kailash as a sacred lake. This nomad is not actually getting water for drinking. He's actually picking up water so he can take home, because that is sacred water. Indians do the same thing. Indian pilgrims do the same thing. So what China is doing now, this is supposed to be a transboundary park. They are building a missile site at the edge of Lake Manasarovar, as in recent news, because of their clashes with India. So this not only blocks the pilgrim, it's a total travesty. You can't have missiles in the middle of a national park, which was not being built yet, but it's still a sacred area. It doesn't go together. No way at all. But they don't see it as a problem. I'm going to shift across. We've got about 3 more pictures left here. I've been to Bhutan several times, and I admire what they have done with their parks. They have covered 51% of their area. I did the calculation. The mathematics work out perfectly, including the biological corridors. This is the way it looks. They have ranges. They have forest ranges. They have park ranges. They have people checking all the time. Just make sure you follow the rules. And I'll draw your attention to this place down here called Sakteng Wildlife Sanctuary, which I visited. Sakteng Wildlife Sanctuary is home to the Brokpas, who are nomads who arrived several centuries ago from Tibet. And as you can see, they're getting ready for a trek using a yak assisted, and they don't use firewood. There's no firewood where it's too high. So these are nomads living within the national park. And China says that's not possible. Of course it's possible. Sagarmatha, the back of the Nepalese side of Everest, has 3,000 Sherpas living there. There's no problem. It's a World Heritage Site. The World Heritage people say it's fine. So here we go. They're very small in number, the Brocas. This is the lead yak. You can tell because it's got a red section there. They always designate he doesn't look too happy about this trip. Took a while to get going. So I'm going to come back finally to the Tibetan nomads. This is a woman from Yushu. Yushu was affected by an earthquake. Nomads, I've been in Tibet in the 80s and the 90s when none of these national parks, or very few of them, were around. And there was lots of nomads around in those days because the settlement policy had not started. And then slowly they started to disappear. They started disappearing from the Everest region. They started disappearing from here, from there. But the thing that really struck me was in Zhongdian, which is called Gyaltang in Tibetan, and the Chinese changed the name to Shangri-La, and based on some sort of something in a book. So they changed the name to Shangri-La. Not only did they do that, they rebuilt Shangri-La to look like Shangri-La, mock Tibetan buildings, whatever. Mock hotels, fake Potala Palace hotels, things like this. And what was really striking was went to Shangri-La in the 90s, and there was Tibetan nomads begging. I'd never seen a Tibetan nomad begging. So this was very disturbing. They're entirely self-sufficient. They don't beg. And I want to leave it there because it's very sad what's happened. So over to you, Shirab.
Oh, thank you, Michael. It's indeed, it's very sad for anyone who really believes in humanity. The entire situation of Tibet, including the forced relocation, has been nothing but a tragedy. So we'll start with some questions. And so I have first a question, and this question is open to both Kyinzom La and Michael. So what could be a long-term impact of China's policy on forcing Tibetan nomads to give up their lands and relocate to places without any real preparation?
So, yeah, I think we have touched briefly on that. Of course, there are impacts on both the people and the community, as well as on the environment. The impact on community, as we have just talked about, what is happening to the nomads. Nomads are once a very proud, community, self-sufficient. Their wealth is measured in terms of the number of livestock they have. But now, being forced into the urban fringes of the Chinese towns, people are totally uprooted from their traditional way of life, from their ancestral land, with no kind of skills to cope in this kind of new urban Chinese-dominated economy. They're very lost in that environment, and sadly, many of them have turned. There are serious social consequences. People turning to gambling, drinking, alcoholism, etc. Now, the Chinese government has paid some compensation to help people give up their land, but then this compensation is nothing in comparison to the loss they have faced, they have suffered. And people now, the nomadic people who are now living in these big towns, they're surviving not because of the compensation. They're surviving because they have to rely on the caterpillar, fungus economy. And that is also very unpredictable. Over the last few years, nomads and Tibetan farmers who have to give up their land, they have done relatively well. In fact, a lot of people are doing quite okay because of the caterpillar fungus economy. But now, the Chinese businesses are investing in, producing caterpillar fungus in pharmaceutical companies, and so it is a very precarious situation for the economy of the Tibetan nomads and the farmers who have been forcibly dislocated from their land. And then, that's on the community and the people. And then the impact on the environment, as we have talked about, it is the nomads who have skillfully looked after the land for many generations. And now taking nomads from the grasslands, that has serious consequences on the environment, on the grassland. Grassland needs these nomads because their grazing, their seasonal grazing is actually good for the health of the grasslands. And now, leaving these grasslands depopulated, it's giving rise to lots of, unwanted species of plants. You are seeing the grasslands turning into deserts because they have been left, untamed by the people of Tibet. So there are serious consequences, both on the environment and the people.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Kyinzom. Would Michael like to add anything on this?
No, I think next question, because I think she's covered that.
Okay, sure. So I have another question. So we have seen several protests in Tibet on different issues. And I'm just wondering if what kind of protests have Tibetans been involved in with concerning to national parks and reserves in Tibet?
I can answer to that one.
Sure, Michael.
Actually, it's not so much the national parks. It's more the sacred peaks. Like Kailash, for example, there's no protest against Kailash, but there's protests about peaks. I'll give an example. Kawakapo, which is part of the 3 parallel rivers, you saw that World Heritage Site. Back in 2011, Chinese company started to mine gold, but it was right near the Kora. There's a circuit around the Kawakapo. Tibetans were so infuriated, they went out and they just threw all the equipment straight over the edge of a cliff into the river below, and that was the end of that. But normally they don't get this opportunity. Normally it's police show up. And we've had this in Zato. Don't know what year that was in Zato. I think it was 2013. The Tibetans were protesting about mining inside a national park or a national reserve. They weren't called national parks at that point. 400 police showed up. Riot police, right? 1 person killed, 13 people hospitalized, many arrested. And these people had a protest. They put out banners showing Xi Jinping, talking about preserving the environment. They were ripped down. They were trashed. So this is what happens. And then we have the case of the Samdrup brothers. They established an NGO. I think it was called the Snowlands Great Rivers Environmental Protection Association. They won awards. They tried to shut down officials who are poaching animals. This is a common thing amongst officials, trophy hunting. And they were arrested, beaten. Kama Samdrup, one of the wealthiest men in Tibet, he made his fortune from Z beads. He was put in jail for 15 years. He won't be out of jail to 2025. This is what happens to Tibetan protesters. They get shot, they get arrested, they disappear. They have very little chance of protesting, even when it's the biggest protest will come up because of the sacred peaks. That's when you get the biggest protest. And Kailash happens to be a very sacred peak.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you, Michael. I'd like to follow up with another question to Kyinzom. You earlier mentioned about almost 50% of Tibetan plateau being turned into a national park. And there are also reports about millions of Tibetans being impacted as part of this China's ambitious plan. And yet we see very little, attention, international attention, or discussion on this kind of issue, or for that matter, any Tibet-related issues. So could you comment on what really pushes Tibet international community away from talking about issues, especially in this context issue about the relocation of over 3 million Tibetans and turning over 50% of lands into national park by CCP?
Yeah, I think, first of all, I think I think the awareness is increasing. We are seeing slightly more attention in the international community on the Tibetan environment than we used to a few years ago. And that again is not an accident. It's a result of many years of Tibetans and the Tibet movement working hard in this space. But that said, there's a long way to go. And in the meantime, the Chinese propaganda has been so successful. The Chinese government, as we all know, is totally unapologetic about its propaganda efforts. It's a huge machine, the propaganda machine in China. And we can see that everywhere, in every corner of the world, whether in the media, in our academia, in our political systems, and the aggressive, the expensive, resourceful propaganda machine from China has really worked to that extent, which is why even if you do see, some media reports on the national parks or on the nomad displacement, they will use a lot of the Chinese government's language, the propaganda language. And so the Tibetans and the Tibet movement have to really know that, communication is a long game. It takes many years to develop a narrative, and it takes many years to kind of get that narrative entrenched and embedded in the people's mind, in the media, and that's what has happened. It's the Chinese propaganda that has really pushed that message about the Tibetan nomads and about the Tibetan environment, that the nomads are doing this voluntarily, and that the Chinese government is doing this all for conservation and environmental protection. So what we have to really invest in is the communication, telling our story well, being very skillful in how we tell the story, and so that's a big part, I think. Yeah.
I could talk about that a little bit.
Sure, Michael. Please, go ahead.
Yeah. Kyinzom has brought up some important points, very important points. The grasslands of Tibet are huge, massive. Qinghai, Amdo areas. I mean, this is a huge carbon sink, and it's being held in place by the grasslands. If you take away the grasslands, the permafrost is going to start melting. You're going to have desertification. It's going to impact the whole of Asia. It's not just Tibet we're talking about here. We're talking about a system that's been in place for 4,000 years, which the nomads have developed. It's not a natural system. It's a system that's co-evolved with the yaks, the grazing animals, the millions of grazing animals, not just the herds, but the millions of other animals, which are all gone. And, that's holding the permafrost in place. It's stopping desertification. It's very, very important. But what has happened here is that China has co-opted people like the UN World Heritage People. It's co-opted the WWF, which is, by the way, one of the most corrupt NGOs in the world. If you want to check it out, check out Panda Leaks. It's a book. And it's co-opted Conservation International in the Changtang. They say, we don't want nomads in there. We don't want the Changtang nomads. Get them out. And then it's co-opted National Geographic, which is owned by Disney, by the way. Now, National Geographic is using terms like eco-civilization. This is not a natural term. This is a Chinese propaganda term. So they've managed to co-opt these important NGOs into supporting them, putting a seal of approval on this travesty. Sure.
Yes. Oh. I was actually going to follow up that with the similar question, because we recently saw this article by National Geographic on the top issue related to the topic, and I couldn't help but notice that the article was written very much in the style, the language that CCP usually uses.
Yes.
And so, you briefly touched upon this topic. Could you elaborate a little bit more on the kind of relationship that is between Chinese authorities and Western NGOs, such as WWF?
Well, now you're talking Disney now. Disney owns National Geographic 73%. You saw the problem with Mulan. They'll get away. They're very pro-Chinese. So obviously they're pushing a pro-Chinese line. But that's not, National Geographic does not use the words Tibet and Tibetan anymore. They just wiped it off their maps. They put out a map in July. One tiny little section said Plateau of Tibet. The rest of it talked about third pole, anything else but the word Tibet. They've taken the word Tibet off their map. This is a major geographical service that people trust. But under Disney, I'm afraid it's gone the way it's gone to the dogs. So National Geographic, we'll probably talk about them for half an hour, but we won't. The thing is that they're using their own, they're supporting their propaganda, let's put it that way. Most of that article is about pandas, and of course China's big on pandas, and it's a symbol of the WWF. They didn't talk about the other parts. They never talked about the nomads. As a matter of fact, they said in the article, we're hoping that the 653,000 people who are currently in these new parks will stay there. That is absolute baloney. The first thing they'll do is kick them out. And there won't be any Tibetan rangers at all, because you can't put a gun in Tibetan hands because it will backfire. They never put guns in Tibetan hands. So the rangers will have to be Chinese. I'm sorry, I just don't trust Chinese rangers. They'll probably shoot the animals and sell them on the black market in TCM. That's what they'll do, to make money. I mean, China has the worst record in the world for making species go extinct, including species in its own territory, like tigers. There's no tigers left in China. I don't know if that answers your question, but National Geographic needs to be more responsible.
It did, Michael, certainly. And I wanted to follow up with another question, just related to the comments that you briefly mentioned, which is the serving of Chinese in the ranges. One of the issues that affects Tibetans in Tibet on their day-to-day life is the discrimination that they face in terms of employment opportunity. So I wanted to ask, are there any Tibetans employed as rangers in China's national parks and reserves?
Show me a picture. I've never seen a picture. I can show you a picture of a ranger in Sikkim, the Forest Bureau, Forest Department. I've taken a picture in Bhutan that shows the Forest Department in Bhutan. I've seen rangers in Bhutan. I've seen people patrolling in Bhutan. I've never seen anything like this in Tibet. Never. Any of the parks that I've visited, I've never seen a ranger. And, how difficult is it to make a ranger uniform? They make plenty of PLA uniforms. You go to Tibet, there's 10 different kinds of uniforms. There's PAP, there's fire people dressed up in military gear. All you have to do is get a baseball cap, and you get a badge, you put it on the lapel, you get something like this, right? That's all you have to do. They're rangers, that's all you have to do. But do they do it? No, they have not done it. I've not seen a single picture of a Chinese ranger or a Tibetan ranger. They won't let Tibetans be rangers because they're too good at the job. As you see from Kekashili, they're just too good. They'll shut down the poachers. They'll shut down the mining companies. They're too good. They won't employ them. Conservation International says that it would. It never came through. It was all talk, empty. No substance behind it. How difficult is it to make a ranger uniform? It's not difficult. So without the rangers, the parks are useless. It's like having a fleet of buses with no drivers. That's nice to look at, but it's actually practically impossible to do anything with it. It's just it's a sham. It's a farce. Some of these parks may be genuine. Maybe the panda one is genuine because they want to save their pandas. It's the only animal that Chinese don't eat or consume in TCM. The rest of them they consume. You should ask Kyinzom a question.
Yes, sure. So, this is a question very similar to the first question that I asked to Kyinzom, but to a different subject, which is, what do you think about the long-term? We discussed about the impact, long-term impact this would have on the Tibetans in Tibet, but what do you think is the long-term?
I think Sherab is having a problem. Internet connection, I think.
Yeah, I can't. Where is Sheriff? He's gone. Well, it was finished anyway. It's like time's up, right?
Yeah, we are nearly there.
It's his connection though, because I'm on, you're on, but I see his face has disappeared.
Yeah.
I think maybe we can conclude then, unless he's coming back. Fortunately, he's trying to come back.
He was saying that he was having some internet connection problems.
He was having a Wi-Fi connection problem, which he fixed before we started, but maybe it's coming back again. Well, Kyinzom, it's too bad that you're leaving. You coming back in 1 year?
Hopefully before too long.
Was it 1 year or not? Is it longer than 1 year?
Hang on, Sherup's left the call. So does it mean
Oh.
that we should also leave? We should. Why don't we wait for a few
We'll wait
minutes?
a little bit. Yeah, we'll wait a little bit.
We will try to come back.
We're still live. It says, I think a thing up the top there says live on the left-hand side of your screen. The red button that says live. So maybe you're still live. So maybe you can continue talking. Hang on, we're getting something now. He's coming back. He's trying to come back. There he is. Yeah.
I'm
What happened to
sorry
you?
again. So I had to, my Wi-Fi again got shut down and I got connected to a personal hotspot. I'll just quickly
Okay.
check if our Facebook is still on live.
It is.
Yeah,
I see a
please.
red button.
Okay, perfect. Yes, Kyinzom, could you continue? Sorry for the disruption.
What was the question?
So the question is, so earlier we talked about what would be a long-term impact for Tibetans who are affected by the forced relocation. But could you talk about what is the long-term goal for CCP in doing this? I mean, and some of this might sound quite obvious to many people, but as someone who has gone through this in studies.
Yeah, so yeah, obviously we shouldn't be under any illusion that this is a very, political project. Yes, it is being done with this conservation agenda, environmental protection agenda. But at the very heart of this project is a very colonial motivation, to control people, to bring them to bring this kind of, freely roaming, significant population of the Tibetan people under a very centralized control system, so that they can control, the Chinese Communist Party can control any form of dissent. And so, yes, at the heart of it, as far as Tibetans can see, this is their motivation. And also, as I said, Chinese policy has always been very misguided from the very beginning of the invasion, of their role in Tibet. China thinks that by lifting Tibetan nomads out of poverty, even though the nomads don't consider themselves poor when they were on the range, they think that backwardness of people in the frontier regions is bad for their political stability. So they think that by bringing people into this modern urban economy, people will grow richer, people will feel more, satisfied with their material development. But then again, it's very misguided. As I said earlier, people feel actually worse off when they go into these new alien modern environments. So, and as I said, people, this is how China has done, in the kind of two hallmarks of the Chinese policy in Tibet. On the one hand, you see the political oppression. On the other hand, you see this economic development, and by developing people, by developing the economy, China thinks that they can win the hearts and minds of people. They think that they can bring the Tibetan people under its control. But the reality is that, it's not working,
Mm-hmm.
in spite of all the economic kind of infrastructure that has been developed in Tibet, there's still a very deep-seated feelings of resentment among the Tibetan people, because they don't know that ultimately it is not serving the interests of the Tibetan people, and that this development has come at a great cost to our culture, has come at a great cost to our way of life. And ultimately the beneficiaries largely have been the Chinese businesses and the migrants. Yes, it is a very political, colonial project.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just add to that?
Sure, Michael.
Just briefly, yeah. I would consider a lot of what the China is doing on the grasslands is experimental. They have no experience. The Tibetans have 4,000 years of experience. They know the seasons and everything. The Chinese have zero experience with grasslands, and they bring in these policies that are absolutely destroying the grasslands. We're not talking about national parks. We're talking about mining. There's extensive mining going on ever since the railway came in. I'll give you one more example. The pikas, which are the rock rabbits all over the grasslands, Chinese decided to exterminate them. They've had 30 years of poisoning pikas. When you poison the pikas, you poison every animal in the food chain that eats them, from all the way from bears, foxes, sand foxes, eagles, owls. Everything is going to get poisoned by eating those pikas. It's disastrous. And it's been called out by international scientists that the pikas are actually they're actually part of the grassland system, and they're very good for the grasslands. They make holes in the grassland. They provide places for birds to nest. It's been totally experimental, and this experiment is very, very bad. That's just one experiment. The other experiment they're doing, taking the Tibetans off the grasslands. That is a very bad mistake, too.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So I have just one last question, because we started a bit 5 minutes late, and I'll wrap up with this one last question to both of you. So Canada is currently going through a stage where it is considering the reassessment of its policy on China, and I hope a big part of this reassessment would consider human rights situation in Tibet, in Hong Kong, in East Turkestan. So what would you say to an advocacy group like Canada Tibet Committee, our supporters who are based in Canada, and the Tibetan community in Canada? What would you recommend in this context?
You want me to speak first?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay. First of all, you have to get Canadian miners out of Tibet. They used to be the biggest mining group, foreign mining group, used to be Canadians. There's not many of them left now. They're also involved in the railway. That's one thing you have to do. The other thing is that the permafrost studies that the Chinese did to put the railway in was based on Canadian technology. They used trains up in the northeast where they had to freeze the permafrost, and the Chinese copied that model. They took Canadian technology. They took it for the railway. They took it for the permafrost. And, the mining, they took their mining technology, then they booted them out once they have the technology. So you have to stop this transfer of technology from Canada, which is being used for highly destructive purposes. That's one thing. The other thing is, I think Canada has a responsibility here, especially with the mining companies, which it totally ignores. They just do whatever they want around the world. They have a very bad reputation. And this has to stop. The biggest mining companies in the world, they're all stationed in Toronto and Vancouver. 75% of the mining around the world is done from those two bases due to tax dodges. So, Kyinzom.
Yeah, thanks. So I think Canada is in a very similar situation as Australia. Both of our countries are so economically reliant on China. In fact, and speaking of Australia, the Australian economy has been so tied to the Chinese economy. For the last 30 years, Australia has never had a recession, and for the first time we are facing that now because of this coronavirus pandemic. So this is really offering us an opportunity, for all these countries who believed that, as China becomes more prosperous, as China becomes more, economically integrated into the international community, that they would also become more democratic, more free, etc. Now, all these hopes have been dashed to the ground, and they are waking up to this new reality that China is not a real partner. It is actually a threat to their economy, to their democracy, to their sovereignty. And so this is an enormous opportunity for us. But as long as these countries like Australia and China or Canada and the US and the European countries continue to do trade with China, we are not going to see much difference on the Tibet issue or on human rights issues. So I think the talk is has already started. The talk about being less reliant on the Chinese economy, the talk of importance of diversifying their trade relationships. And I think, yes, we should push that message, that China is not a reliable partner at all. I know, more moderate people in the movement would say that, human rights and trade can go together, but the reality, as we can see, is with China, it cannot go together. And we have to, push our governments to be more confident, to be more clear-eyed about the situation in Tibet, and once and for all, reimagine and reset a whole new relationship with China. Until that happens, I think we can't expect much change on the situation, on their policies on Tibet. So, just as we expect our countries to reimagine a new relationship with China, it is also an opportunity for the Tibet movement as a whole to reimagine our own kind of position and our own narrative. So, yeah, it's an interesting year, to say the least.
I think one more thing you could say here, Sharp. Forgetting about Canada and Australia, let's look at a global perspective. You might think that this is not my problem. The grasslands in Tibet, who cares? But when that permafrost melts, starts thawing, that becomes your problem. That permafrost is going to release methane, which is 30 times more powerful than CO2. That is a global problem. There's no way around that. And it's a tremendous increase in greenhouse gases. And, it's a huge carbon store, Tibetan Plateau, massive carbon store. I don't know exact figures. But it's going to become your problem, no matter where you are. It's not going to be just a Tibetan problem.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Michael. So that was the last question, and so we're wrapping up this session for today. And before we go, I would like to quickly add that Kyinzom is on the last few days with the Australia-Tibet Council, and so we're very happy and thankful for you to join us, take your time to speak on the issue with the Canada-Tibet Committee supporters. And Kyinzom will be joining Amnesty International Canada, and we wish you good luck, and we hope you'll come back
Canada,
to the
Australia,
world of Tibet
Australia.
issues. Right.
Amnesty International Australia.
I hope Alex Neve is not watching this. So yes, Kyinzom will be joining Amnesty International Australia, and we hope you will come back to the world of Tibet advocacy in future. And Michael recently, those of you don't know, Michael recently joined Canada-Tibet Committee as a consultant, as an advisor, and we're really thankful for you. That's an honor for us. So thank you, Kyinzom. Thank you, Michael. And so this is how we end today with thank you to both of you, and thank you to everyone who's watching this.
Thank you, Sherbla.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah.